Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 5 from the book Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Dr. Robert Cialdini. And if you guys remember last time, going over Chapter 4, I believe that was social proof. Yeah, social proof. So what was social proof? Social proof basically said that whatever the group is doing tends to be correct. So for compliance requests, if you can somehow convey that the choice that you want your receiver to comply with is somehow complied with by everybody, it's going to make it more powerful. So we talked about how you can use celebrities to do this. We talked about how you can use just sheer numbers of people to do this, like conveying that, like 75% of people do this one thing, or hey, this one big time celebrity does this one thing. It's going to make it more powerful. But today we're going to talk about authority. Now, what is authority? Basically, well, following an expert. So, Dr. Cialdini starts off, as he does in many of his chapters, with a little bit of an anecdotal study where they surveyed people at this large international bank in London. Not so much as surveyed, but they were campaigning for donations for charities. And they had a couple different groups here. They had a control group where they had just like a standard request. Hey, do you want to donate to this charity? Didn't really get that great of a compliance rate. Then they had a second group where they had a celebrity come and visit the large international bank and make the request for donating to the charity. This one got slightly better, but still not that great at 7%. Then they had a third group where they approached people with a pack of sweets and then asked for the request to donate to the charity. This one got better compliance at 11%. So this, like approaching with a pack of sweets, this would be kind of be like reciprocation, where you give something to them, hoping that they would reciprocate the favor back. There was a fourth group where they had a letter from their CEO asking them to donate to the charity. This one got 12%. So far, this is the highest one. Letter from their CEO. What do you think this represents, the CEO? Authority. The CEO being the highest, probably the highest person in the company. This authority figure garnered the highest compliance rate when they heard from their CEO. Now, it's not that much greater at 12 compared to 11% with this reciprocation, but they actually added a fifth group where they combined the reciprocity and the authority call. So the pack of sweets and the letter from their CEO got the highest compliance rate at 17%. So Dr. Cialdini is going to talk about the differences in authority. Or the differences with authority, being in authority and being an authority. So being in authority means like what does this mean? You're in charge. In authority, you're in charge, versus an authority means you're like an expert in a field. So in authority, the CEO is in a position to affect the outcomes at work. That's kind of what in authority means. You have the power to affect outcomes in somebody's life. So the CEO can make your life a living hell at work, or they can be a shining bright spot at work and cause you to succeed and, give you things to make your job a little bit easier. But your CEO could also be an authority in that they have 20 years of experience in the financial field. They've managed other banks before. So they could both be in authority and an authority. Nowhere is the authority principle exemplified the most than in the Milgram Study, the Stanley Milgram Study. If you guys have probably heard this super famous psychology study where I think it was Stanley Milgram administered shocks to people, right? So he had one person in another room who was supposed to answer questions from the test subject who was in a different room with somebody in a lab coat, seemingly like an authority figure, right? This person, the test subject, would ask questions to the person in the other room. If they got it wrong, they would have to be administered shocks. Now, what ends up happening is the person in the other room gets some questions wrong, so they're getting administered shocks, and the shocks keep increasing in magnitude, so they're hurting more. And the person in the other room says, stop, please, no more. They get to a point where it's hurting so bad that they're screaming. Now, the person in that room is not being affected. This is all kind of being simulated. You know, the test subject is the one that's asking the questions. They don't know what's going on. Even with the cries from help from the other room, the test subject still continued to administer the shocks because that person in the lab coat in the room was telling them to continue on. Super famous study. I remember back just in high school psych classes that we would talk about that. We talked about that study quite a bit. It was very prominent. And this is all just due to the power of authority. Now, they did measure the Milgram study to see if there was a difference between males and females. There really wasn't. Females still continued to administer the shocks. They just to make sure, they measured the psychological, basically measured that the people weren't psychopaths, that the test subjects weren't out there to hurt anybody, that they were mentally stable, and they all were. So it really leads us to believe that the guy in the lab coat telling you, hey, now continue going, they'll be okay, you know, that made all the difference in the world. And it's this power of authority. About 2/3 of the participants in Milgram's experiment pulled every shock switch. So they went to like the highest shock that you could go to. Nearly none of the subjects stopped after please, that should be like please, cries for help from the victim to stop. Now, the interesting thing was Stanley Milgram surveyed folks at Yale on what they thought the results would be. Generally, people way undershot the results of the study. In general, people thought that only 1% to 2% would give the shocks until the bitter end. And like I said, results were similar across genders. And the results were still high even when the victim explained about his potential danger. So this was like if the victim was, you know, crying out, not just for help, but for saying like, oh, I have a heart issue, I can't go on much further, you know, stuff like that. Nope, they still continued on. And like I said, they were normal psychologically. So the reason was this authority figure. Now, Milgram ended up reversing the study in a way where the authority figure now, instead of telling the subject to administer the shocks, he would now tell the subjects to not give the shocks, even when the victim insisted that they would go on. And what ended up happening was the person would be left confused. Confused. They didn't really know what to do because there was contradicting authority figures in the room. So the subject was trying to figure out, okay, who's it really in authority here? Is the person in the other room, or is it the person telling me not to give the shocks? And to further this point, there was this case of S. Brian Wilson in 1987. There was a protest. So I think this guy was protesting U.S. shipments of military equipment to Nicaragua. Mr. Wilson and two other men stretched their bodies across the railroad tracks leading out of the Naval Weapons Station in Concord, California. Lo and behold, what ends up happening is they try to, the train just speeds forward, does not really make any attempt to stop. Two of the men managed to scramble out of harm's way, and Mr. Wilson was not quick enough, being struck and having both legs severed below the knee. Oh, man. But Mr. Brian Wilson was not, he was accepting of what happened because they were just doing what I did in NAM. They were following orders that are a part of an insane policy. They're the fall guys. He didn't blame any of the crewmen on board that train saying that, oh, they should have stopped. He was saying, you know what? They were just following orders, following authority. And that's where you kind of have to be careful with authority because, like that title section slide says, there's allures of obedience and there's trappings of being that blindly obedient. And it could be a good thing at times, but it can also be a detriment and lead to some trappings and leading to people to lead you astray. Because authority does provide an advantage. You have a certain leaders that can provide structure and can provide organization. It can basically prevent a society from running into chaos. We're taught this from a young age to obey authority figures, obeying your parents, obeying your teachers, obeying your priests, bishops, like higher authority figures in the church, obeying higher leaders in military, at work, etc. And you really count on these people because you're figuring that they probably know more than you do. So you figure, hey, why not just obey authority? Because they probably know something that I don't. They probably have a greater access to information that I don't. So I'm going to listen to them. You see this a ton, in medicine. You see this a ton in medicine where we put so much stock into doctors. This is what we should. They've, gone to school for a long time, studied a lot, have lots of experience. But we even see in the medical field where there's errors that doctors get things wrong too. And they have errors in their everyday work, and yet they go unchecked because we just see them as the authority figure. Oh, they must be right. There was this famous TV commercial, the Vicks Formula 44 cough medicine. Or I guess, isn't Vicks is like the vapor rub, right? And the person, this was like in the 80s, I think, they had a doctor on TV, was like a spokesperson for it, but he was an actor, actor Chris Robinson, who played Dr. Rick Weber in the TV drama General Hospital during the 1980s. And the famous phrase was, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. Kind of slick marketing there because he's an actor, right? But he's dressed up as a doctor. He looks like an authority figure. We're going to talk about how titles and why if you're an authority figure. So people would associate, okay, he's not a real doctor, but he looks like a doctor. So you start to associate it with the fact that he's an authority on this Vicks vapor rub. So like I said, there's different symbols of authority. How do you know somebody's an authority figure? Well, one way, like Dr. Rick Weber, is the title. And Dr. Cialdini says it's simultaneously the most difficult thing to fake and the easiest thing to fake. I want to make sure I get that right. Titles are simultaneously the most difficult and easiest symbols of authority to acquire. Okay, to acquire. To earn a title normally takes years of work and achievement, yet it is possible for somebody who has put in none of the effort to adopt the mere label and take on that role. So Dr. Cialdini tells this little anecdote about how, I don't know if it was him or a friend, where if his friend introduces himself as like a professor, then people become very like respectful, proper. They watch what they say in front of him because he's denoting his authority at a certain subject. So people tend to act accordingly. They don't want to be seen as like dumb or stupid in front of him. They're kind of watching what they say because they think, okay, he's got the title of professor. He must know a lot of, again, have access to information that they might not have. But if he doesn't introduce himself as a professor, PhD, what have you, then the tune is way different. They're friendly, they're warming, they're cracking jokes with them, joking around, just way more loose with it. Another study with titles in how people tend to distort people who have titles with being taller, more powerful looking, bigger, kind of larger than life. And the study was done at an Australian college where a class was told that they were having a visitor come in from Cambridge. Now, the visitor from Cambridge was introduced with different titles. In one group, he was introduced as a student. In another group, he was introduced as a demonstrator. In another, lecturer, senior lecturer, all the way up to professor. So from the beginning of that list, so student to professor, so from lowest tier to the highest tier. And the study found that with each status increase that he was being introduced as, the students estimated his height to be taller, 2.5 inches taller by the last group where he was being introduced as a professor as compared to the student. Crazy. And it's almost like authority gives you a certain halo effect. Like you could be an authority like a professor, an authority in your subject field that you study and that you teach at, and it gives you kind of a halo effect in other areas too. You're seen as not only smart in history, the subject you teach, but also maybe in like for finances, for math. You're seen as more trustworthy, right? It's got that sort of halo effect, even though, I mean, sure, you probably maybe got some information in all those things, but are you an expert in all those things? I don't know. So we see this height advantage in the Australian study. And it's not really too unusual because, we're assuming somebody in authority is being more powerful, again, more knowledge. So it has that sort of halo effect. And this is what we see in nature too, because usually the larger, more powerful animal usually wins. So animals tend to make themselves look bigger, larger than life. Like you see this with a cat that's really pissed off, arching its back, like furring, or not furring, but like its coat, its fur like spikes up, makes itself look bigger, right? So we kind of extrapolate that to the Australian study where, okay, somebody's in authority, they're probably got that way by studying hard, maybe by, well, I don't really want to say looking bigger. I don't know what I'm trying to say there, but essentially we just think people in authority are more powerful. So part of that powerful appearance and persona is feeling bigger, right? So another study, going back to doctors and how doctors can go unchecked, was a study where they had this dummy doctor call on nurses' stations to administer a drug. So the drug was unauthorized, and the dosage that the quote-unquote doctor gives to the nurses is completely wrong and off, like way more than they should be giving. And to boot, the nurse never even met this doctor. This is a completely fake doctor. But still, 95% of the nurses go on to administer the drug. And it's just, this is the theme throughout this whole book that we talk about. Click run, FAPs, fixed automation patterns. Just a click run response. Hey, a doctor's calling me? Okay, click run. They're right. Administer the drug. There was another study where, I don't know if this was a study, but this was kind of a story that Cialdini talks about, where you had these security system hackers just hitting a bunch of banks, and they didn't have to use any sort of fancy technology, any fancy like coding skills. They just snuck behind the bank security, wearing official government safety gear, official gear of inspectors, pest controls, the whole gambit. So they used those disguises to look as an authority to get past security. Nothing fancy. Which brings us to the next symbol of authority. So we talked about titles. Now we're going to talk about clothes. So Dr. Cialdini talks about a study, the Leonard Bickman study, where they would ask people to pick up some trash. Now, in one group, they asked the people to pick up trash in plain street clothes, versus in another group, they asked the people to pick up the trash while wearing a security guard's uniform. And most people complied when they were faced with the request from the security guard. Then they did a kind of a sidebar, or an addition to this study, where they had the requester in the uniform would make the request, hey, please pick up the trash, and then they would leave the vicinity. And the power of the uniform still stayed present. The people would still comply even though the security guard wasn't watching. And this was not necessarily the same thing when you had people in plain street clothes. So what I'm guessing happened is when the people in plain street clothes let me finish. When the people in plain street clothes asked for others to pick up trash, the people who did it, which was a decreased percentage, keep in mind, when the plain street clothes would leave, as soon as they left, the people would probably stop picking up the trash. Like, oh, he left. Nothing to see here now. But the power of the security guard's uniform stayed with them, stayed with the people who complied with that request. They asked college students to guess the compliance rate with the street clothes requester. And they pretty accurately guessed it, but they underestimated the compliance as a result of the uniformed requester, which was 92% when the uniformed requester asked them to pick up some trash, versus 63% is what they kind of guessed. So kind of like a little above 50-50. So it's very high. 3.5 times compliance following a guy this is a completely different point. So they would have a guy jaywalk, and they had different groups where the guy would wear a suit versus plain street clothes, and they found 3.5 times compliance following a guy jaywalking when he wore a suit. Right? It has nothing to do with the fact that we're crossing the street. Everybody crosses the street, but just by the fact that this guy's wearing a suit makes them seem like, oh, we should follow him. On page 221, let me go here. Oh, yeah, this is the bank examiner scheme, a really sad scheme. Essentially, this is kind of like the Nigerian prince. Kind of. The Nigerian prince emails that maybe people get. Oops. I mean, I didn't write much here. We can go to the next slide. It's just a very unfortunate scheme that a lot of elderly people fall for. So they have this bank examiner quote-unquote bank examiner who would come to their front door. Let me try to summarize it for you guys. He's wearing something very nice, like a very nice-looking suit, and he basically asks the people, in the end, he's basically asking for the elderly person's, bank information. Like, oh, we had a power outage at the bank. We had a slight malfunction at the bank. We just want to make sure that your account is okay. Can we have your account and can we check? And they happily give it to him because he's dressed up like a bank examiner, like a guy who works for the bank. And what ends up happening is it ends up being a scam, and they just take their account and take money from it. Kind of just like summarizing it for you guys, but it's on page 221 if you wanted to check that out. So we got titles. What do we got titles, we got clothes. And next we have trappings. So trappings kind of similar to clothes, but stuff that's flashy. That's the trappings. Designer clothing, jewelry, could be cars too, etc. Watches, or I guess that's jewelry, but this kind of stuff carries prestige with it. So if you see somebody dressed up, what's a nice suit company? Hugo Boss, maybe? Yeah. Hugo Boss. Or somebody wearing, a Rolex watch carries a sort of prestige with it. Makes them seem like they're an authority. Like, hey, they have to be an expert in something to get that kind of nice stuff. At least that's what I tend to think. But again, it could be cars. In a San Francisco Bay Area study, drivers waited longer to honk their horns at luxury cars versus regular cars in front of a green traffic light. So this happens all the time, right? You're at a red light, all of a sudden the light turns green and the car in front of you doesn't go. So people would wait longer to honk at the car in front of them if it was a luxury car. And again, the interesting thing in this chapter is when he asks students to estimate the results of the study. And students greatly underestimate the time it would take for them to honk. So essentially, people downplay this authority principle a lot. And I think it's because people don't want to seem like they could succumb to it. People don't really want to believe it because we believe in our minds, oh, I would never do that. I treat everybody the same. I'm respectful to everybody. And yeah, like I definitely think that too, but there's definitely times where, yeah, people with titles, people that wear certain clothing, I probably do treat them, let's not say probably. I do treat them differently. And I thought that was interesting. Male students were way more inaccurate with that. So, authority, obviously, but an authority, an versus in authority. How credible are you? How is your expertise? That is what an authority is. Now, people who are in authority, Cialdini kind of gets at this, that in authority is not as powerful as an authority, because a lot of people just don't like being ordered to do things. People don't like to be bossed around. Now, people would still comply, but would you get consistent compliance? Would you get compliance when that person's not watching? You might, based on the trash pickup study that we talked about a few slides ago. But is it better to be in expertise? Would people be more willing to follow you when you were an authority versus in authority? So being an authority, like we were talking about, creates a sort of halo effect. Makes you seem very trustworthy. That's my next slide. But Cialdini talks about how displaying diplomas, certificates, degrees in your room, like in your office building, what have you, those people tend to be rated as more friendly, kind, and also as being like great at whatever they got their degree in. So in this case, it was a PT, a therapist, or was it behavioral therapy? What have you? Some sort of therapist. So the diplomas and the certificates made him seem like a great therapist, but they also made him seem like, hey, they're very friendly, they're very kind, they're very smart, etc. Creates a halo effect in many different areas. Trustworthiness. So being an authority is not just expertise. You're not just showing that you are an expert in something, but you're also showing that you are trustworthy as well. And remember how we talked about this in a different chapter too. Oh gosh, what was it? Was it the reciprocation chapter where we talked about how when you I think it was the I think it was the reciprocation chapter, where if you display a weakness, or if you not display a weakness, but if you describe a drawback early on in the compliance request, you're seen as more trustworthy, and therefore people are more willing to comply to a request. So if you're selling a car and you talk about how, hey, this is a great car, it has this much gas mileage, it has, this much room in here, it doesn't look as great as these other cars, I'll give you that, and we don't really have it in the same sexy colors, but other than that, like, this car has all these other features. So when you do something like that, you're seen as more trustworthy, more honest. And Cialdini gives countless examples of this in this section of the book, where from like trial attorneys to political campaigns, advertising messages, the new Domino's. Oh my gosh, I remember these commercials where Domino's specifically highlighted in the commercial how bad their pizza was before and how the steps that they were doing to improve their pizza now. He gives an example of a job interview where you're more likely to get that job offer if, you say some things that you are not good at. Hey, I'm not that experienced in this and this, but here's what I do really well. More likely to get that job offer. Warren Buffett does it at his yearly Berkshire Hathaway, not press conferences, but conferences, I guess you might call them, where he talks about mistakes the company's made. Again, if I'm hearing that, I'm thinking, oh, wow, this guy's really honest. He's very transparent. Versus if somebody who's just talking about all the positives. It kind of makes you think like, God, what's he hiding? You know? Oh, geez, yeah. Online reviews. These are hard to judge, right, sometimes? Because, yes, the higher the rating, like if you're looking at Amazon, yes, the more stars, the more likely it's to be perceived as a more valuable product, perceived to be true, but only to a point. Only to a point, because there comes a point where you see thousands of 5-star reviews and you're like, okay, there's no bad reviews here. What's going on? Right? You start to question it a little bit. So the more stars, the better, but to a point. And maybe it would do you better to look who exactly is giving those stars. Are they verified buyers, or are they just anonymous people? Because if they're all anonymous, well, you kind of have to start to wonder, right? And like I said before, with starting out your compliance request with something negative or like a drawback of the compliance request, in the same light, negative reviews add credibility to online purchases. And again, verified purchasers versus paid reviewers. Verified purchasers seen as way more trustworthy than paid reviewers because obviously the companies that made that product paid you to give a good review, or you're going to be kind of swayed a little bit by the money that they paid you to review the product. So defense. How do we defend against this principle of influence when it could be potentially used nefariously? So how do we defend against it? Well, Cialdini basically says, hey, just ask yourself this one question. Is the authority truly an expert? The compliance request that is being given to me by this authority figure, are they truly an expert? And then 2 follow-up questions from there. What are their credentials? And are their credentials relevant to the topic at hand? So case in point, you have a professor of history, right, asking you to invest in their mutual fund or in the same mutual fund that they are participating in. Is the authority truly an expert? Okay, probably in history, but in finance? What are their credentials? Okay, well, they're a PhD in history from such and such university. Okay, but is that relevant to the mutual fund that he's trying to get me to join? Something like that. That could be like a possible scenario that would run through your head. And then another question. How truthful can I expect the expert to be? Because even authority figures can present their information in very misleading ways. You know, is the expert getting me to comply because they are truly concerned for my future, for my current situation, for my financial situation, if we're talking about the previous example? Or are they looking for me to comply to just enhance their position? What do they stand to gain from me complying? And Cialdini talks about this little story here using waiters and waitresses and tips and how they basically increase the tips that they're going to get. Basically, they do it by increasing the bill and how much food you get at the particular restaurant. So they do this a couple different ways. The waiters, waitresses will change their demeanor based on who they have at the table. If it's like an older couple versus a younger couple versus just like a couple of kids, a group of friends, etc. They also seem as more trustworthy by doing tactics such as, ooh, I wouldn't get that tonight. I've heard it's not that great, but I would recommend this. Makes you seem like, oh, they're on your side. They have the inside information. They have the inside scoop. So it makes them, again, makes the waiter or waitress seem more trustworthy when they have that sort of transparency to some of the food. And then later on, they kind of cash in on that. It's kind of like reciprocation in a way. They cash in on that by asking for desserts at the end of the night or asking if people would like a glass of wine. So just keep on racking up the tab. And yeah, like I said, they're reciprocity and authority mixed in one. So, a summary on this chapter. We talked about Milgram. And what Milgram found as far as people following authority, even when the person on the other side of the room was being shocked and they were pleading out, no, please stop. They still followed that authority figure. We talked about the different symbols of authority, titles, so being like a doctor, a PhD, CEO. Talked about clothing as a symbol, so wearing, again, if you're a doctor, wearing that white lab coat. CEO wearing maybe just a name badge that says you're a CEO. Well, no, that would be more of a title maybe, but construction equipment, you'd be seen as an expert in construction. If you're in like an NFL uniform, you're probably seen as like an expert professional football player, right? Trappings, that's another symbol of authority. Just nice watches, jewelry, nicer designer clothes, designer bags, cars. We talked about being in authority versus being an authority. So an authority being like a credible expert versus in authority being what was the in authority meant that you can affect a person's life by making them comply. Right? So an authority, credible and an expert, in authority is making somebody comply. And they can both be successful. They're both successful ways of doing authority, but I think Cialdini kind of hints at an authority being way more persuasive, because in authority, when somebody's in authority, people just tend to not like to be told what to do. So it's better for compliance requests to come from an authority. And what makes you seen as an authority? Well, the fact that you're knowledgeable and the fact that you're trustworthy. Or when you see somebody as an authority, you think of them as A, knowledgeable, and B, trustworthy when people are seen as an authority. And then we talked about, lastly, defense. Asking those questions. Are you truly an expert? Are you truly an expert in this field? Do your credentials match up with the compliance request that you're asking me to do? Or do they not even go together? And then lastly, how truthful can we expect this expert to be? Are they leading us astray? Are they using their authority-ness, just made that up, to lead me astray or lead me to their own personal gain and not mine? And that sums it up for Chapter 5 from Influence. Next week, or next episode, there we go, got it right. We are going to be talking about scarcity. So this is going to be Chapter 6. So we're motoring through. We're about halfway. Yeah, halfway done with the book. Lots of great information in this book. I hope you guys are getting a lot out of it. Totally recommend buying it, and especially this the new edition. I have here the 2021 edition, which comes with an updated updates, new research and examples, and then like 2 new chapters. One of them being a brand new principle of influence called unity, which is going to be the second to last chapter we go over. But thank you guys so much. Over on the Chee-Tash podcast, we've got a brand new guest coming out for the month. That'll be out in a couple weeks. Did a solo show, so check out that solo show where I just, not too long, I think it was about 20 minutes, just talk about a certain topic. That's going to do it. Guys, thank you very much for listening. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.